Hey, everybody. It's your friend Adam. I'm here with another Think Club debate. Victor, how do I pronounce your last name? I don't want to pronounce it incorrectly.
Magariño.
Okay, so we're here with Victor. We're going to talk.
Yeah, we had this same problem last time.
That's funny. The debate question today is going to be, is inequality a product of exploitation? And Victor is taking the affirmative, so he's going to be going first. I'm going to be busily jotting notes and attempt to steelman his argument. In my portion, he made a couple of videos, and I didn't link to them in the description now. I linked to his channel. They're on his channel. So I watched those videos. I think we have a good idea of where we're going here. I still have some questions, but I saved them for the debate. Drew is going to be moderating. If anything is unclear, Drew, just speak up. You're kind of the ears of the audience. So if you're confused by what we're talking about, we want you to speak up so we can clarify things. And I will turn the floor over to Victor and let Victor say his opening argument.
Yeah, so am I timed or anything?
We do 10-minute opening arguments, but I'm loose on the time. Like, make your point.
Okay. So today we're debating inequality and its relation to exploitation. And since it is my intention to set these two major terms clear and allow them to converse with each other on a dialectical fashion, I want to begin by looking at each one individually, and from there allow for the manifestation of their obvious relationship. Now, inequality in its broadest sense is a quite abstract term because it can potentially emanate from an indefinite amount of circumstances. So I want to make it clear that the form of inequality that is the object of this exposition is that of economic inequality. Other forms of inequality will be present, but only as the direct or indirect product of it. Economists normally define economic inequality as an uneven distribution of resources existing amongst societies, individuals, classes, ethnicities, genders, and a wider variety of social groups. Both the resources that are unequally distributed and the societal factions are real material elements that can be the object of scientific study. So inequality at the economic level is thus not a universal metaphysical concept that exists outside of its historical time and circumstances, but it is a quite concrete object that can only be fraught with meaning if understood by looking at the material basis of a determined society at a given time, where the actual class relationships of that society reside. It is for that reason that we must make it clear not only which form of inequality we're interested in, but the specific materials. Make it clear that my interest here is on the economic inequality that finds its origin on the capitalist mode of production as it exists today, even though I will be making analogies with other modes of production to support some of my arguments. And so now that we have specified this first object of discussion and we have framed it on modern capitalism, we can proceed to make a description of it before seeing if it is best explained by the theory of exploitation or not. Fortunately, anyone who lives with their eyes open is already aware of the preponderant levels of inequality that characterize our present world. So hopefully I will not be making a description of something that we do not know or at least suspect. So wealth and income distribution are the two most popular indicators for such phenomenon, that being the reason why I will focus more on this. And if we look at the data on income in the United States, for example, we find that in 2016, the top 1% had an income share of roughly 20% of the total. But the United States is relatively equal compared to other countries like capitalist Brazil, where we see that the top 1% owned close to 29% of the total income share. The data for the Middle East is also quite similar, but what I want you to start noticing here is that Europe and China, in comparison to all the other countries where capitalist mode of production prevails, and here I'm not necessarily saying that prevail in China because that is the topic for another discussion. Well, China and Europe have relatively less unequal distribution of income, since the income share of the top 1% in these two powers does not even reach 15%. I will get to why this is the case later on, but for now, wait a second. Okay. There's a problem here with my script.
What happened? You lose your place?
No, it just crashed for some reason. Okay. So where I was here. So the top 1% income share does not even reach 15% in China and Europe. I will get to why this is the case later on, but for now I also want you to notice how there is also a similarly odd trend in the data for income distribution within these countries amongst subsequent years. For example, the data that we have for Russia tells us that a quite dramatic story happened, since if we look at the income share of the top 1% from 1980 onwards, we see that its total cumulative real growth is of 686%. But this is nothing compared to the real growth of the top 0.001% in Russia, who have seen a 25,000% increase. And I repeat this, 25,000% increase. And I mean, do you want to know what the increase was for the bottom 50% in Russia compared to these two other numbers? It is of minus 26%. So here we're speaking about a situation where the bottom 50% of one of the biggest countries in the world have seen a decrease from 1970s, 1980s till 2016 of about 26%. Not even a stagnation, but a fall. And this situation is quite scandalous, but it does not stay in Russia alone, because the real income growth in all other advanced capitalist countries follows a similar trend. So the question now is, what happened from the 1970s, 1980s onwards that transformed in such a manner the distribution of economic power? And let's remember that economic power does not simply stay at the level of the economy, but actually translates into all other forms of power, one of the most important being the political power in that society. And here is where the next key concept jumps into the picture, that being the concept of exploitation. So exploitation, as I will be using it here, is a term used in Marxist economics to mean the differential between the value generated by productive laborers and the wage they receive in the form of variable capital, which is known as surplus value. This is a material aspect of capitalism that, due to the fact that it exists and can be analyzed, is the object of scientific studies and measurement. What allows us to understand it and its implications? And the common measurement that takes the form, the common measurement for exploitation takes the form of the rate of surplus value, which is the ratio of surplus value to necessary value, where necessary value is the value that productive laborers, and here I specify productive laborers, need in order to reproduce their labor power. Both of these variables being the product of history. As Marx already pointed out in Das Kapital, the rate of surplus value is an exact expression of the degree of exploitation of labor by capital in a given society at a given time. So I do not want to get too technical here, so I will leave the development of the model of exploitation there for now. But Adam will, however, present all my sources and the studies where this data is shown on the description of this video once it's posted and I send them to him, in case you want to analyze them for yourself. And before we look at the data on the rate of exploitation in order to prove how the rising levels of inequality we see from the 1970s, 1980s onwards on the entire capitalist world are mostly due to the increase in labor exploitation, I want us to focus on another measurement that can indirectly lead us to such conclusion. This measurement I'm speaking about is that of the bargaining power of labor, as shown in statistics such as the ones on trade union density. And this data aligns quite neatly with the story about inequality we previously heard. And before I present this data, I just want to remark that in order for our model to be empirically accurate, we would expect to see a greater levels of inequality in the places and historical moments where workers have less bargaining power and less representation in political institutions. So is this what the data shows? Yes. For example, if we look at the collective bargaining coverage in the United States in 2014, we see that it was of roughly 12%, which is a quite obviously a quite low number. And that in the same year, the level of inequality was also quite high, as the data shows. So if we compare this data with, let's say, France, where inequality was considerably lower than the United States in that year, we find that the collective bargaining coverage was of 98.5%, thus making a big difference on the advantage that capital can take over labor compared to the United States. And the same goes for Finland, Sweden, Norway, etc., where the collective bargaining coverage does not even go under 65. And this story can also be seen looking at the United States historical data as well, where it is obvious how as trade union density increases, like in the period from 1930 till the 1980s, where the attack of labor on labor done by the Reagan administration was reached its climax, the share of the top 1% during this time decreased substantially. Again, this data will be facilitated to you on the description of this video. And now comes the important test, which is this important test will prove whether or not our theory, and directly will prove whether our theory, our hypothesis, is correct. And that is looking at the actual data on the rate of surplus value and whether it skyrocketed on the United States and the entire capitalist world as inequality also increased and the bargaining power of labor fell. And the studies done on the rate of surplus value indicate that this is indeed the case. Economist Simon Mohun did a critical analysis of one of Shaikh's works, which he did with Tanak and other economists, where he improves their computation of this measure and shows how the data indicates that from 1970 till 1970s, 1980s onwards, the rate of surplus value has gone up quite drastically. Another study done on a doctoral thesis by a Spanish author also indicates that the rate of surplus value has increased exponentially on the same period in the entire capitalist world, what conclusively proves that our thesis is at least not empirically inconsistent. And this is not the only thing that shows that we are correct, because if we look at the gap between wages, real wages of productive laborers and productivity, we also find that a specific form of exploitation is being done, that being the extraction of relative surplus value, which happens through the improvement of technology and the depreciation of the value of productive laborers by this process. And we would not say that these high levels of inequality come from any natural inherent capacities of the ones on the top 1%, because this is clearly not the case. And I am not here denying that some level of inequality needs to exist in order for a society to work, to function correctly. And I am not denying that human beings are born unequal and that a lot of the inequality can be explained through biological, natural means. But what I want to say here is, for example, if we look at the data on the wage difference, on the income difference of white families to Black and Hispanic families, we see that white families are exponentially, have seen their living standards increase exponentially, and they're worth a lot more than Black and Hispanic families. What indicates that if we would not say that white people are, even though a lot of white nationalists out there will be tempted to make this conclusion, we would not say, someone that is rational would not say that this is due to the fact that white families are, they are superior, or they have any inherent biological capacities that make them more intelligent or more productive. But this is actually the product of a historical development of the exploitation of the Black population in the United States done throughout centuries, which, even though slavery ended, has continued in other forms. So we would find a more scientific explanation instead of jumping into natural, universal laws that we cannot even comprehend. So what I'm asking you to do here is to do the same, to look with this scientific lens to inequality between classes and between countries. And so what it is conclusively shown is that inequality once you have big and powerful state formations, comes mostly from the exploitation done by one class over the other. And this exploitation is not a moral concept, it's an actual scientific measurement that tries to look at an actual material force. That's it for my presentation.
Okay, I took a bunch of notes. I'm going to try to steelman your argument. I think there's like three main points I want to drill in on. I might ask you some questions along the way, but this is technically my 10 minutes. So just if I ask you a question, obviously answer, but try to keep interruptions to a minimum. So as someone who has grown up in a trailer and grew up in the Central Valley, I can attest that there are plenty of poor white people out there. Like, I've met them personally. So I sometimes I feel like when people make the disparity between blacks and whites, they seem to forget that there are a lot of poor white people too. So
Absolutely.
whites are definitely the majority. So there's going to be, well, there are plenty of white people that are doing successful, and I don't deny that there aren't as many black people or Hispanics that are doing successfully. There are plenty of poor white people out there. So just to get that out of the way. So the point that you're making, just to steelman your argument, you're talking about there's a small amount of people that control most of the resources. That's your main premise. And you're saying that they the reason why this exists is because they are exploiting workers who are paid more. They produce more than they are actually compensated for. And you also threw in a third point, which is a correlation between unions being low and income inequality being high and wages being depressed. So you're saying that the source of this inequality, small number of people controlling most of the resources, is correlated with depressed wages. So you're making the connection between those two. Is that pretty much your argument?
So what I'm saying is not necessarily that those who control the resources, not necessarily that those who control the resources do so because they exploit others, but rather because they own the means of production. They own the means by which we produce these commodities, these services that are exchanged in the market. And the fact that they own this puts them in a position of superiority that allows them to exploit, thereby reproducing their power. But the means through which they get power is not exploitation, but the owning. I mean, it depends, but essentially is they own means of production, and thus they can exploit.
Well, I pulled up some statistics on small businesses because I'm curious how that fits into owning of the means of production. In the United States, 99.7% of U.S. employers of firms are actually small businesses. 52% of small businesses are home-based. That's huge. Like 50% of businesses are actually just sole proprietorships. Actually, 52% are home-based. 73% are sole proprietorships. 20%, only 20% are corporations, and only 2% are franchises, which I think are what people would typically think of as, a corporate-owned thing. But they're actually, like the local McDonald's is a franchise that's owned by an individual in the community that's technically a small business. So 50% of the U.S. workforce is actually working for small businesses. So I don't necessarily know, like, is the local restaurant someone who owns the means of production? Does that figure into your theory as well? Are these small businesses part of this means of production argument?
See, it depends. So, I mean, here we're talking about, obviously, we're talking about means of production, not local, small size means of production. Here we're speaking about actual factories with a decent amount of workers, etc.
Okay.
And if you speak about a small business, for example, where the employer works alongside their workers and who essentially has the same power than the workers on the production process and does not get to, in a sense, appropriate the surplus value produced by the other workers, then we're speaking of a situation completely different.
So you're
This
in
looks
favor
more,
of that situation.
this looks more
Okay.
like what Marx, for example, and other Marxist thinkers would set as the sort of ideal, less exploitative form of owning, of producing things, whereas small size, small scale, or even bigger scale. I mean, it depends on the historical moment you're at.
So you're
right now,
halfway
this is
there
not
then.
so.
You're halfway there. 49.2% of the U.S. workforce is
No, but
employed by
this-
small businesses.
See, this is not necessarily the case. It's not necessarily the case that this does not happen, because as the data shows, exploitation has been increasing exponentially, and this is not due to the fact that people work in smaller, let's say, businesses, and they do not produce. And there's also a difference between productive and unproductive labor that we also need to take into consideration here.
Well, it seems a tad bit of a non sequitur. I want to dive into what you're talking about with this small amount of people controlling the most resources, because I actually think that's.
But this is not the case.
I actually think
amount of people do not. A small amount of people, yes. I mean, a small amount of people own most of the resources, but it's not the case that they do so collectively.
No, they do. They do it individually, but you cited figures in the beginning of your talk where you were saying that you're saying like 1% of the population owns 80% of the resources. Is a common thing that people cite. So you're saying that.
I wasn't saying, I didn't cite that statistic in particular.
What was the statistic you cited? Do you have?
I said that the top 1% income share, the share of income in the United States in 2016 was of 20%. Yeah, 20%, roughly 20%.
Okay, so explain that to me. The 20 per. What do you mean by that?
The share of income.
Okay.
So the income received by all factors of production.
Okay.
The share that goes to the top 1% of the U.S. population.
Okay, so a small number of people. Mm-hmm. They get 20%. They get 20% of the income, and you're saying that they shouldn't get that 20%. You're saying that's an outsized reward.
What I'm saying, I'm not giving a moral argument here. What I'm saying is that they do so, and that the means through which they can do so, but they weren't. For example, during the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, is due to the fact that they have more bargaining power over labor, and that they can thus exploit to a further degree the labor of productive laborers.
Okay, so let's get into that. So you're saying exploitation is the fact, and I've heard professors like Richard Wolff say that you know, if you're working 8 hours in a day, you're producing X number of value for the company, and they're paying you a small percentage of that value that you're producing for the company. And he says his argument is this is exploitation. If you're not getting close to the value you're producing for the company, then you're being exploited. That's the argument, right? That's the same argument you're making?
Yes, but I mean, you're making it sound a little bit as a moral argument. What I'm saying here is there's a difference between what the worker, productive laborers, again, it needs to be productive. Do you know what the difference is in classical economics between unproductive and productive labor?
Well, I would say, just taking a guess, that the unproductive labor is the labor that you're producing something that nobody wants.
No. So unproductive labor is the labor that exchanges against revenue, whether productive labor is the labor whose wages are exchanged against capital, against variable capital. And so productive workers are the ones that actually produce the commodities, Whereas the
okay.
unproductive workers, even though they might be,
You're
even
like
though they
accountants
some
you're talking about, basically. Like
yes,
accountants
or like the
and like
military
overhead.
or the
Yeah,
military,
totally.
yes.
Okay, I got you. So they aren't actually
Even though they
going
are necessary,
right.
even though they're necessary, they are not actually producing any value. So when we're
Overhead
speaking
is
about
what we would
exploitation,
overhead is what we tend to call it.
so when we're speaking about exploitation, this is a category only that can only be applied to productive labor, since they're the ones that are producing value. And here I'm not saying that they should receive the full amount. Marx was also not saying the same thing.
Okay.
Some level of exploitation needs to exist because those unproductive workers, some of them might actually do work that is necessary for the community, and you need to feed them. They need to live a decent life as well. So some part of whatever is produced obviously needs to go there. But what the main argument here is, the best way to do this is if we get everyone to decide, everyone who has produced this, to decide where is this surplus value allocated.
So you even use the term some level of exploitation. So are you conceptualizing anything that the worker produces that he's not compensated for as a exploitation? I mean, is that why you're saying
That
some
is,
level?
I mean, when you define an object, anything that lies in that category is to be considered as that which the object you have defined.
Well,
So
I don't know
even
that
though
it's
it might be on a less scale, it still exists. And what I'm saying here is the same way that inequality needs to exist in order for a society to function correctly, some level of exploitation also needs to exist. The problem is when you have a few amount of people that own this much power and can thus use it to extract even more surplus value whenever the circumstances allow for it.
well, the difference between the word inequality and the word exploitation is exploitation, there's a moral component to it. The definition of exploitation is an action or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. Now,
and this is why I specified my definition of exploitation, which is the strictly scientific definition of the differential between the value generated by productive laborers and the value that they receive in the form of variable capital.
So you're taking the moral component out of exploitation. You're saying
yes, I am.
So exploitation has nothing to do with unfairness.
It doesn't mean that I personally in my spare time don't take a position and prefer that workers are not exploited. It doesn't mean that. What it means is that when we are making a scientific description of something, I can be making a scientific description of earthquakes, for example, even though I want to avoid them as much as possible, and I don't like what they
but we would never call earthquakes killing machines, though, because people would that adds a moral component to it that just totally pollutes the conversation. Like, why would we do something like that?
And exploitation it doesn't have any. I mean, people have often used it to mean something that is in the realm of morality. But Marxists have always used it essentially to depict this differential. And then Marxists, a lot of them, like me, for example, have said, well, I mean, I don't agree with the fact that this is happening. And the workers themselves actually do not like this. So once they are aware of this situation, they will most likely rebel.
So you're saying
you're taking positions.
No, you are saying there's a moral component. If you're saying that they do not like this, you're saying there is a moral component. If you're saying they're going to rebel, you're saying there is a moral component.
I'm describing that people will not like to be exploited, but there does not need to be any moral component there. People will decide whether they like it or not. What I'm saying is that they are most likely not going to like being ripped off.
See, ripped off, exactly. Good. I'm glad you brought up ripped off, because I was going to mention Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff comes out and makes the argument that if you're not paid what you're producing, you're getting screwed. He literally uses the word screwed, which means he says you're getting ripped off. So that just denotes the idea that you're in a situation that is unfair. And I would not think most people believe they are in an unfair situation. Most working people wouldn't want to be in an unfair situation. They would look for work elsewhere. When you're talking about exploitation, I thought of two examples for unfair things that definitely reek of exploitation. One, and this happens all the time in third world countries. Both of these happen in third world countries predominantly. In states where income inequality is based on some sort of exploitation, the people in power force people to buy things that they don't necessarily want or need. They force them to buy from their friends and cronies, which in a free market situation, they would buy from the least expensive provider. So this is obvious exploitation, but I don't know how you could link that to some sort of capitalist system. It seems like capitalism is trying to fight against this kind of exploitation. The other system is in these third world dictatorships, taxation, and they have a way of doing taxation where it's not necessarily like we're used to in the West, where we pay some sort of income tax. A lot of people complain about the levels of taxation, but I think this is where the argument is over whether or not it's exploitation. I think most of us will agree that if we're in a 90% tax bracket, we're being exploited. And most people in third world countries, even poor people, are taxed at around 90%. Bruce Bueno de Mesquita and Alastair Smith do these numbers in the book, The Dictator's Handbook, and also in their paper about political power. And they talk about how in these nations where income inequality is rampant because politicians are feathering their own nests at the expense of the population, exploitation is a major factor there. And that in nations where we have democracies, democratic republics, our taxes are always lower. Yes, everyone wants to pay lower taxes. I believe 30% is too high. But this is where we're having a conversation on where that line is, where it actually becomes exploitation. I don't think it's helpful to just say any level of one person taking from another is exploitation, for the same reason that I don't think we should call earthquakes killing machines. Like, it adds this moral component to it that I don't think is helpful for the dialogue. But
and this certainly doesn't have any moral component. What I'm saying is, look, you, for example, said something that I agree with, which is some forms of taxation, like the one you described in third world countries where they tax even poor people to such an extent, is also a form of exploitation. It is not the same form of exploitation as the one done in the production process under a capitalism of production, but it's also one form of exploitation, which is taken in the form of taxes. This, for example, was quite popular in feudal societies. We had a feudal lord that taxed whatever the workers in a given field produced to as much as they wanted, and this is a form of exploitation as well. You know what a form of exploitation is as well? Slavery is a form of exploitation, but the fact that they are all forms of exploitation and that some are more exploitative and that some might be less, depending on where you draw the line, it doesn't mean that they are not exploitation, you see? And one of the reasons why Marx was so specific on this issue is because he knew that a lot of people would try to misinterpret it.
Well, slavery fits the common definition of exploitation. Like I said, that's the action or fact of treating someone unfairly in order to benefit from their work. So slavery definitely fits that definition.
If you say unfairly, then you are actually giving a moral component to it.
Yes,
what I'm
exactly.
saying is there's a differential between what the slave produces and what the master gets, and that differential is exploitation.
Right. I understand that
and this is done through a political system that allows for some people to own as property others. But in capitalism, for example, the capitalist does not own the laborers. In fact, this is the false sense of freedom that is so that in a sense denies to a very far extent the class consciousness in the proletariat, which is the fact that they have this apparent freedom to decide something that they actually cannot decide,
Right. So
which
you're
is who's going to employ them, etc. And this depends on the bargaining power that they have. And as I said, and the data shows that whenever workers have more bargaining power, societies tend to be more equal because you eliminate this tension between classes. You eliminate it to some extent, not entirely, but to some extent, and thus you allow for people to get to their full potential without having somewhat of an extraction of whatever they produce.
you're sacrificing some efficiency, though. Do you agree there? That
Yes, but you see, this is one of the topics that is very important in this conversation, which is at some points you need to have somewhat more exploitation, and at some points you need to have less, depending on what the productive forces, the development of the productive forces in your society, in your historical time, and depending on the availability of resources. And I am completely in agreement with you that whenever you have more democracy, you lose efficiency, but also you are more likely to get to the outcome that benefits more all. And this is why we improved from authoritarian archaic monarchies to modern bourgeois democracies. We did this because we understand that even though it takes more time, we have the resources to do this, and this yields a result that it's more equal.
can you give me an example of some time when you need more exploitation? An example of when more exploitation is needed?
Well, for example, you see in Great Britain, before the Industrial Revolution, you have a standard European feudal society. And in order to set the Industrial Revolution going, you needed massive amounts of investment, massive amounts of technological improvement, and you needed to escape what in economics is known as the Malthusian trap, which essentially tells us that whenever some technological improvement happens, population will rise, but as there's this scarcity of resources, the population will tend to decrease, mortality will tend to go higher, birth rates will try to go to less, going less and less, and then you will have a stabilization of population. And what you needed to do is you needed to escape the Malthusian trap. And in order to do this, there needed to be immense amounts of exploitation. And this is the situation in which Marx was at. But he realized, he said, look, now we have unleashed so much productive potential that we do not really need to have kids working in factories. We do not really need to have this level of exploitation that is making the entire working class so unhappy and so unhealthy. What we can do is we can set another mode of production that works on what we already have, on the improvements that capitalism has brought about, and from there improve so that we reach more democracy. And here we're speaking about democracy at the economic level, which for Marxists, it's the main level at which democracy has to exist.
Well, I want to dive in on the first point that you were making. You less so as most Marxists tend to make. Well, and a lot of progressives make this point that they don't like the fact that a small amount of people control so many of the resources. So just on that topic, I conceptualize those people as kind of human resources to develop innovations for society. The idea of making society more equal will be putting resources into the hands of people who don't necessarily know how to use them efficiently in a business type acumen, which business is what drives our innovation. All large businesses start as small businesses. The small businesses are competing to become larger businesses, and they become larger businesses by filling some need that society has, some desire that society has. So if you're taking resources from these hyper productive individuals because you're saying that what they're doing is exploitation, you're kind of kneecapping your economy because those people need those resources. Like we want to put as many resources as we can into people's, like Elon Musk. We want him to be able to, like, he's working on going to Mars. That's a project that I think most of us can get behind. But if he doesn't, if government steps in and takes those resources from him and distributes them more equally, then we don't necessarily have the ability to do these larger projects that tend to be the projects that are more beneficial to society.
So here, I agree with you, but not entirely. And let me explain why. So it is very clear that some people, the ones that are more qualified to do so, should have a bigger role in the production and distribution of economic resources. I mean, I don't have any objection to that. What I'm saying is that as people start getting more power than the one that is healthy for everyone, you find yourself in a situation where this power does not necessarily lead to the best social outcome. And this is why monopolies, for example, are even under neoclassical consideration inefficient, because they tend to produce less welfare, less utility for consumers, especially because they sell at a price higher than the market price. Thus, you have a concentration of power that puts someone on a position where the collective good might not be reached. And what we need to see is, yes, those that are more intelligent, that they are better prepared, should have a bigger role, but they shouldn't have it all. This is the argument that, for example, was used to justify authoritarian socialist countries. I mean, in the USSR, this was a pretty common thing to say. Well, don't criticize Stalin. Don't say anything about Stalin. He's the one that knows everything. And if the economy is doing bad, well, that's not his problem. That's someone else, because he's the expert here. He knows. So give all the power to Stalin, and then, you see?
Yeah. So I want to touch on one more thing, and then we'll go to questions. I want to touch on you seem tepid on this argument that most Marxists are making, that the worker produces X value, and if they're paid a fraction of that value that they produce, they're being exploited. They're being treated unfairly.
I'm not giving, again, I'm not saying here, even though I personally might consider that they're being treated unfairly, the same way that I might consider that as master treats unfairly their slaves. What I'm saying is that I'm just describing it.
Right.
If you want to give it a moral component on your own, do so.
I
am just describing it, and I'm saying, of course, I don't agree with it. I am in the position of the one on the one that is being exploited, the same way that most people, I would reckon yourself, is in the position of getting rid of the slave master dialectic, right? But even though I choose that position, it is not the case that I am moralizing about the fact that it exists.
I don't think wage earners feel like they're being treated unfairly, though. I feel like the reason why we lost you a little bit there, Victor.
What I was saying is that you could also speak to slaves in the climax of, for example, the Roman Empire. You could speak to slaves who would tell you exactly the same. I don't feel I'm being treated unfairly. Look, I can buy my own freedom, etc. So what I'm saying here is, you need to look at things more objectively, and you need to make a description of things and where this tends to go. And whenever you have whenever you have more authoritarianism, whenever you have less power for the community, at some point or another, this contradiction, this conflict of interests, is going to translate into it's going to get to the position where the previous mode of production cannot exist any longer. And this is why, for example, I agree with the statement that the real utopian is not the socialist who wants to overcome capitalism, but the one who thinks that things as they are right now can continue to work without major changes.
You're
Even
comparing.
Elon Musk and all of these capitalists that are in the position of seeing where the economy and the environment and everything is going agree with this, and they are trying to look for new alternatives. Some even want to go to Mars.
You're comparing anyone who works for anyone as a slave, though. That's like completely denigrating to them.
I'm just making an analogy. You see, an analogy
yes,
is not
it's a terrible
exactly
analogy.
the same.
Yes.
No, it is not. It is not. It is a relationship of power that is analogous on the sense that it leads to exploitation. Not the same level of exploitation.
Listen. Let me give my points on why I don't think every single employee out there wants to categorize himself as a slave. First of all, it completely eviscerates your status in the world when you conceptualize yourself as a slave. So
it doesn't matter what your feelings are. What matters is the objective facts.
Well, I know. See, but when you're talking about something like slavery, I think if you're in a slave master situation, I think 99% of people would say that there's an unfair component there, especially in the modern world. But I don't think people think of working for an employer as being unfair. They do this calculation. They understand why they produce more than they take home, because they understand.
Not necessarily. Do you think that a lot of workers, and this is why, for example, there's slowly more and more pressure for workers to get to more democratic, more equal forms of production. This is why, for example, cooperatives are becoming more and more popular, because people want more power. This is what people want. People want to be free.
Some people want that.
Level of freedom. And you might want, you might want for people to not feel, and I, for example, I feel bad that I didn't win the lottery last time I played, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter, right?
How many people do you think want more power? Like, my gut intuition says it's 20%, and 80% really don't want the more power. Like, the 80% are telling themselves that, the reason why I take home less than I produce is because they understand that the business has to survive in order to sustain them. They understand the business owner is taking on more risk. They understand the business owner is paid last and may not get paid.
Not necessarily. See, this is something that they might think is the case, but it's not the case. You can run a business without someone extracting the surplus value from everyone else and deciding what to do with it, and obviously getting the bigger share.
But the surplus value serves a purpose to sustain the business. The business businesses are hard to sustain.
What I'm saying is,
go ahead.
Absolutely. And what I'm saying is, some surplus value needs to be created. There's workers that don't produce value that need to be there.
But you're saying the unfair portion.
One person decides.
Okay, go ahead.
What I'm saying is that one person decides what to do with it, instead of that being a collective decision, makes that process susceptible to being quite exploitative, to the extent where we see that whenever workers have less bargaining power, they are exploited further, because someone sees himself under the circumstances where they can extract even more surplus value. Because you extract some surplus value, but if that puts you in a position where you have more power and you can extract more, the rational thing to do is to get to more and more and more and more. This is the law of accumulation of capital. And this is the law of capitalism, essentially, the accumulation of capital. And this is an impersonal law. You see, it works regardless of how you feel about it.
Maybe we should go to questions. I think I made my point. I think you've made your argument. Is there anything you want to say before we go to questions?
No.
Drew? Yeah. So I think the first thing that would be useful is if before we go into questions, there are a lot of questions. They're basically all questions for Victor here.
That's fine.
Yeah, I think a lot of it centers around his definition of exploitation. So I would ask him to, could you go ahead and define your definition of exploitation here?
Let me define it so I can have another shot at steel man.
Yeah.
I think I understand what he's saying. I think Victor is basically saying that exploitation has to do with any level of surplus value that the worker produces that does not go home with the worker. And he's saying that there's not a moral component to that it's just a technical term that Marx uses for the amount of value that a worker produces that they don't take home themselves. Is that correct, Victor?
Yes. Yes, okay. Especially that they don't get a decision over, essentially.
Right. I would argue that they are ceding their responsibility to make that decision to their employer because they're thinking the employer can use those resources to better the business and eventually give them more money. So I would think that that's how they conceptualize it. So they're not going home at night thinking, I'm a slave.
And you see, and in most cases, they don't even have access to this data that only the capitalist and his circle has access to. So they don't really know how much they could be earning if it wasn't for the capitalist.
Right. In this day and age, I think
give them the information, give them the decision as well.
Okay.
This is what I'm advocating for: more freedom and more access to information.
Drew, does that make sense? Is that clear?
So essentially what you're saying is that it has to do with surplus value produced by worker that they don't have a say in what it goes to be used for. Was that the idea?
Is the differential between total value produced by productive laborers and the necessary value to reproduce their labor power. And this necessary value is a product of history.
Okay. Okay, so I'm just going to ask some of these questions. Some of them may be missing your position completely, but they're questions that people are asking because there's Marx underneath the title of this video. So I'm just gonna ask them. Yeah, okay. So is inequality necessarily bad? Is someone who writes beautifully versus someone who writes horribly a bad thing?
No. But what I will ask this person is to say, well, why does someone, what I'm saying is, if someone has better qualities, it's obviously that they should play a better role and so on. But what I'm saying is, why some are in the position of writing better and someone else not? Why are white families more educated and thus they can have access to better jobs? Why black families are not, for example? And this is because of a relationship of power and a relationship of production that is the product of the historical development of the United States. And what we need to understand is the underlying material causes of this, and that some level of inequality is inevitable and that it should exist to motivate some people, to give them a reason to work harder and to improve themselves. That is necessary.
Okay, yeah. A question that just got asked is, how do you calculate the value of a person's labor? So I guess this is in response to your definition of exploitation here.
Well, necessary value is a calculation that is done by Marxists, and in the studies that I will link, this takes on some statistical, more complex analysis. So I will leave in the description the studies where you can see this more profoundly. But it's essentially looking at the total value, and you compute looking at the prices of the goods and services that the workers need in order to survive and reproduce themselves. And then you see what the necessary value for a worker, for a medium for a mean or median productive labor is, and then you have the necessary value for their subsistence. And this is different in China than in the United States, which is why there's been a lot of movement of factories and of productive and of production to China, because their labor is cheaper, because the necessary value to reproduce a Chinese worker is well, relatively smaller.
Okay. Yeah. So this question I'm going to give a little bit of context to, but this question is: if everybody's rich, why do you care that 20% are 1,000 times richer than you are?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this is in response to there's this common conception among people, I guess you would say free market advocates, about the rising tide that raises all ships up. So even though that the rich may be getting richer much faster than the people that are at the bottom, it seems that people are rising altogether. So I guess that's what this question is addressing.
Mm-hmm. Well, this question is the implications of the question are wrong in many ways. So let me try to say a few. The first is it is not necessarily the case that this is happening. In fact, in Russia, as I just saw, the bottom 50% have seen a decline in their growth of income. So it's not necessarily the case that this is happening. And for example, even if it were the case that it's happening, it would still not justify, for example, I would guess that the person that asked me this question does not agree with Mao Zedong. But it is the case that living standards in China, or for example with Stalin, and it is the case that living standards in China and in Russia grew exponentially during the time, especially after they overcame feudalism. And it still doesn't justify the fact that they had an authoritarian government that had too much power. And the next thing that I said that I would say is, it is still a problem that some are very, very rich, even if it were the case that the rest are also quite rich, because power, as I said in my introduction, does not just stay at the economic level. It translates into power on all other aspects. And if you have some people with so much economic power, it is more likely for them to have more influence in political institutions, to have more influence in the means of communication, in the means of transportation, etc. And this is what ultimately decides how society works. So you are giving them power over the entire economy, over the entire society as a whole.
Okay, I think this is a good question here. So this person says, I want to see this concept applied to something a simple laborer can put into practice. How does a communist or a Marxist open and run a pizza shop? So how would you see that would be run without this exploitation that you think that takes place?
Mm-hmm. Well, it depends. It depends on many things. It depends on the society you're looking at. If we are speaking about a modern capitalist advanced country like the United States, I mean, it's a capitalist country, so opening a communist business in a capitalist country is, I mean, it's I don't really see there too much what the point is, but you can have somewhat of a hybrid, right, between two forms of production, and you can have what I personally advocate for, Richard Wolff also advocates for, which is cooperatives, which is a form of organizing the enterprise that gives power to all workers in that enterprise. And some obviously are in a position where they make some decisions that are relatively important because they are more prepared, etc. But at last, all get a say, somewhat of a say, on what's going on, what the development of this will be, etc. And the fact that you can do this means that the outcome is going to be a lot more equal and beneficial, not only for the workers, but at last, if you make this into a form of production that extends to all the society, to all the economy, it's going to be better for all in general.
I guess to elaborate on that, So you said that some people should have more of a say on what happens. So what would that look like in this example? Like, would it be based on experience or outside education? What would that look like? Like how would that be different than like just a normal system that is in place in typical small businesses where people are raised and through superiority and experience and stuff like that?
So if you're speaking about a cooperative in a capitalist country, what you can have is, for example, a cooperative working like Mondragon here in Spain, where workers have by law of the company a certain percentage of the shares of the company, and thus they have some level of decision, and they have to earn a determined wage that allows them to live, and they get a say on the amount of people that are employed, on the machinery that is employed, etc. So that, for example, if a capitalist wants to implement a machinery that will destroy half of the jobs in that business, he will, if that person has the option to do it and it is economically rational, they will obviously do it. But if it's workers, it is not economically rational for them to do so. So they will most likely try to look for other alternatives, or even better, employ that technology and work less, because that technology will allow them to produce more value on the same amount of time, so that they can reduce the same amount of time to produce the same amount of value that they were producing before.
Okay. So there are a couple questions that I guess they're directed at general inequality, not even necessarily economic inequality. Yeah, so I'm just going to go ahead and add. So this person said roughly 2% of body mass, the brain is said to burn 20% of calories consumed at rest. Is it unfair to the rest of the body that it does this? I guess
No,
I
because
get
Totally
go ahead.
unfair. That brain hog.
Continue, please.
Yeah, I'm guessing people are trying to parse there. So I guess I'll ask a sort of tangential question to try to get at, I think, what this person is expressing here. So
I know what they are trying to mean. I know, because I've encountered this before.
okay, yeah, I guess regarding your definition of exploitation, it doesn't have to do with inequality in and of itself, right? It has to do with people not having a say in, I guess, what they produce. So I guess this is a mischaracterization. I mean, you're not saying that inequality in and of itself is a bad thing. It has to be some sort of it has to do with production.
And especially what this person might be trying to imply is that inequality is somewhat of a natural, that the levels of inequality that we see today is somewhat of a natural aspect, biological aspect, like, for example, the fact that the brain consumes so much energy. But this is not the case. What I tried to prove in my presentation is that inequality is a product of complex societal formations, because, essentially because it comes from complex relationships of power that put some on a position where they can have a bigger say on whatever is produced and distributed.
Okay, yeah. People are not asking a ton of questions that are directed at me now. They're kind of talking about themselves. But I guess one kind of theme here is that I think we should touch on here towards the end is I would ask, just as a personal question, why would we use the term exploitation? Because I feel like a lot of this, I feel like Adam has expressed this quite a bit as well, and I think that people in the comments are sort of getting sidetracked a bit because of the word exploitation, because it implies this moral component. Would it not be more useful to use a term that isn't loaded morally, like coming into the conversation, just so that this confusion doesn't happen? Because I understand once you define exploitation the way you define it, you can objectively measure that in a way that you're not actually necessarily talking about moral components. But it seems to me that it doesn't lend itself to good understanding of the conversation necessarily.
Mhm. Well, I mean, all terms contain a certain level of moral component, substance to them. So I wouldn't say that this is something that you should object to in and of itself. I mean, we are speaking, and I clarified that what we mean by exploitation is this differential, and that the moral component, you give it to yourself, I give it myself. Marx would give his own moral evaluation of it, but what we need to know is exactly whether this is going on or not, whether this is an actual thing that we can measure, and what the implications of it are. And for Marx, the implications of this was that um, there's going to be a concentration of economic resources on the hands of fewer and fewer people, and the tension is going to grow to such an extent that it's going to lead to capitalism's own destruction.
I have one
And
question.
we've seen this already in the past. We've seen a very similar moment in history happening, for example, in the Great Depression of the 1930s, that immense levels of inequality followed by uh, immense an immense amount of loan taking and so on, where the product caused a decline in aggregate demand that put the economy, the US economy particularly, on the worst moment of its history, to the extent where it almost crashed. There needed to be a serious reform in order for it to subsist. So we know that this is a problem. We know that inequality is a contradiction in capitalism that can potentially lead, the same way that inequality, for example, in France, during the time of the monarchy, led to the revolution that embed the old monarchic authoritarian form of ruling.
So I have a question on how automation fits in with your with this surplus labor theory that you have, because we can conceive of businesses potentially in the future where everything is automated, where human labor is not necessary. So the capitalist could have 100% of his workforce be based in automation, and that will still create a person, an individual in society that will be far more wealthy than anybody else because he won't actually need human laborers. So by your theory, he's not technically exploiting anyone, but he will still have all of the economic and political power that you find to be a problem. So what is the connection there in that situation?
Well, you see, here there's a very big. This is a very good question, especially because it goes to the heart of what exploitation is and what the contradictions of capitalism are. Because for Marx, automation was the way through which capitalism would, in itself, advance the factors of production to such an extent that it need not longer exist. Once we have, and I've heard you said this already, once we have overproduction, capitalism becomes obsolete. You see why? Because workers no longer need to exist. People no longer need to work. Thus, having someone on top of all of that is going to create such a massive level of inequality that is going to lead to people asking whether it is fair to have such a system.
Yeah.
There's a good question in the comments. I have no bearing on this. I have not read any Marx, so I don't even know if this question is relevant, but it's a very specific question, so I'm going to ask it. In part 1, volume 1 of Capital, Marx talks about use value, relative value, and true value, but seems to conflate the three at a few parts. Are they separate categories? If so, how then metaphysically do you get the last two from the first two, or the last from the first two?
I mean, this question doesn't really make too much sense. Marx makes a distinction between use value, exchange value, and value as the substance of the commodity. And this value that is in between is, in a sense, the market price that is reached through fluctuations, etc. And what he was trying to explain was market prices. what he was trying to explain is, okay, once you factor out the forces of demand and supply, what lies there is labor as the substance, and use value is something that exists, and use value is not independent from the physical qualities of a commodity, and Marx made this very clear. So it's not a metaphysical concept. Use value. Exchange value is also not a metaphysical concept, because it's the proportion, the actual mathematical proportion through which two commodities of different two different commodities can be exchanged in the market. So this is also not metaphysical. And the last is also not metaphysical, because it is saying, okay, where's the tendency? The tendency of the prices to rise, the tendency of the prices to go. He was trying to explain this. And for him, the substance of value was labor.
So let's go to closing statements. You started, so you're up first. That's right, Drew, right?
Yeah, that's correct. If you start, then you should go first. At the
Okay. Victor, we usually set aside a few minutes for closing statements, so I'll let you go, then I'll do my closing statement, and then we'll finish up. Good conversation.
Yep. So as a closing statement, I just want to say that, well, we have seen that even though inequality is something that is not, in a sense, you cannot overcome inequality because some form of inequality needs to exist. We have seen that the levels of inequality that exist today are a product of the relationships of production that exist in our current capitalist world, and thus they can be overcome through the changing of the mode of production that we live in, that we work in, that we exist in today. And this doesn't mean that, for example, inequality is something bad. Inequality in and of itself, and I don't want to give any more component to inequality. What I want to say is essentially that inequality, even though some level of it has to exist, is a contradiction in capitalism, because capitalism produces levels of inequality that are not sustainable for its own survival. And we've seen this story, for example, in the 1930s and even in 2008. And now we're reaching levels of inequality, of debt, of exploitation, that are, and of tensions amongst, and of conflict amongst classes, that is pretty alarming. And we're seeing a moment in history where the real utopian is not the one that wants to improve capital over capitalism, but the one who thinks that things as they are right now can persist.
So the debate topic is inequality a product of exploitation? I think obviously inequality can be a product of exploitation. And I pointed out several situations where I believe inequality is a product of exploitation, where in economies where wealthy people, where politically embedded people are forcing people to buy products and services from cronies, in situations where they can get products and services less expensive elsewhere, but they're forced to buy from the certain individuals, where taxation is forced around 90% in many third world dictatorships. In these situations, inequality is very much a product of exploitation. But in modern economies, in capitalist economies, I don't see this being the case. Now, I understand that Victor is using a different definition of exploitation, a more technical definition of exploitation. I respect that. I think that it does muddy the waters a bit as far as having a conversation about these things. And I think if there's any way to get around that terminology, I think some of these conversations can be more productive. But this conversation, I think, has been relatively productive. And I want to thank you, Victor, for joining in. I want to thank Drew for moderating, and I guess I will go ahead and leave it there. I have links to Drew's channel in the comments below, or in the description below. I have links to Victor's channel in the description below as well. I will also include, Victor wanted to include some studies that he's done, and he's done a couple videos on this, so I'll add those to the description. And Thank you guys for joining in. Hopefully the super chats will be back on soon enough. This channel is still demonetized. I'm resubmitting for monetization maybe today or tomorrow, and we'll see what happens. So thanks for joining in, everybody. Take care, and we will see you in the next video.